Good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see you after a while. Live and vibrant. I can see some familiar faces on the right, behind my wife. Sister Michelle as well, so it's always good to be part of the fellowship here at Aylesbury. I would like to spend some time going through chapter 25 in the book of Matthew. So if you want, you can open your Bibles there and we can all travel together through this section. This is really when Jesus speaks about last events, and I preached on some aspects of it when I was here last time. In chapter 24 and 25, I think what we find is a blueprint for living as a disciple between the first and the second coming. We find that on the Mount of Olives, Jesus talks to his disciples, and one of the things that come quite clear in chapter 24, that he places a lot of emphasis on watching, being alert, being in a kind of discerning mode, knowing what is going on. And I think that is very healthy in itself. There's nothing wrong with that. Because we need to be able to assess what is going in our environment and know exactly where we stand and how this world that we see fits into the narrative of the gospel. But there is another aspect that also emerges in chapter 25 particularly, which I think we could call a second pillar. So when you read these two chapters, you can kind of picture or imagine two big pillars that hold the fundamentals of the discipleship into one single coherent unit. One is watching, looking around, being observant, being discerning what is going on. But that activity, even though it may be beneficial in itself, if it's pushed to its extreme, it can actually lead to some unintended and undesirable consequences. And I'm sure you have come across a lot of people who are doing this today. You can develop this almost into sort of obsession, where people are watching for things and become so consumed looking for Jesuits and Freemasons and who is doing this and who is doing that, so that almost the entire Christian life becomes one big search for the enemy and just watching and analyzing and finding perhaps things which even don't exist. And I think when pushed to the extreme, that can be quite unhealthy, because it produces, if you like, the sort of disciples that seem to be out of balance. So that's why I think we have another pillar in Matthew 25, which is not to do with watching, but it's a kind of holding these two things in proportion, and this is doing things, not just passively watching, however important this may be, and understanding, but actually doing things, being active between the first and the second coming of Jesus, being active in your Christian life. And if you read chapter 24, you find, and I preached on that suddenly in verse 45, amidst all this turbulent environment, and Jesus saying, watch that no one deceives you, we find this picture of the faithful servant who is actually feeding the household, doing something. And then in chapter 25, in addition to the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, which is all about watching and being discernful, we find the parable of the talents, which is all about doing, not just watching, but doing. And what I would like to do today is to take really a magnifying glass, which I don't have with me, and go over this parable of the 10 talents, which is parable that everybody here in the church knows so well. So I guess my job is, in a sense, difficult. I need to find something that you haven't seen before. And maybe not give you a complete novelty, but expound on this understanding and knowledge that you have, and find some beautiful details that perhaps you may have missed or never seen. All in order to find out more and have a better picture about God, but also to enable us to discover the truth about ourselves. Because this parable is like a mirror. It tells a lot about God, but it also helps the reader to understand and discover the truth about himself. So that's the aim for the next 20-25 minutes, to take a magnifying glass and go in more detail over this parable and see what kind of treasure perhaps we can discover there that we may have not seen so far. So what is the parable saying? As you know, one thing that is quite surprising here, this parable is telling spiritual truths, but it's using the business language. Jesus picks up the business language of his own time to convey some deep spiritual truths about the kingdom. And we'll see how it works as we go through the parable. So Jesus says, "It is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slave and entrusted his property to him." So what we find that this man, who I think is Jesus, but Jesus is actually using, as I said, the image of his own time, and he's using the image of a slave, of an estate owner who goes away. Not uncommon in his time that somebody who would have a large estate and a lot of slaves would go and spend time on a business trip. And unlike today, when you can actually make money by sitting at home, trading in shares or bitcoins or whatever, in those days, if you really want to be a successful businessman, you would normally have to go on a trip. And these trips can be quite long. They can take you to a foreign country far away, which means your return will not be imminent or quick. Now, what can a slave owner do, or the estate owner? He can either leave the estate unattended, or he can say, okay, I have a number of capable people. They're all slaves, but actually they're quite educated. Let's put them in charge, and they will run the estate. And sometimes, even in those days, they would have a contract, and the contract would say, okay, the owner and the slaves would share a profit even sometimes, So Jesus basically takes a common business practice to tell his disciples and tell to us some truths about the kingdom. So the master goes away and he entrusts the slaves with his property. And then we know that he gives them talents. Now, I want to say at this point, as you read this parable, I think the best way to get what the parable is trying to say is not to try to think, oh, he is giving them talents in the way that we understand the word talent. And of course, we get the meaning of the word talent from this parable. But the way we understand the word talent, it's usually in terms of very specific and very distinct spiritual gifts or abilities. So I may have a talent for playing football, which I don't, and somebody may have a talent for singing or for nurturing or for preaching, whatever. But this is not what the parable says. And I think the best way to put yourself in that mindset is to picture a situation where you have a master and then you have a number of slaves, and the master is inviting his slaves to come forward and has a big scale, large scale. And on the left-hand side, the master has about, 5 individual weights, pieces of metal. And each weight has a specific value, something like 75 pounds, shall we say. So the master takes these 5 individual weights, put them on the scale, and the scale, of course, goes like that. It's out of balance. So what the master does, he puts his money, his silver coins, on the other side of the scale to balance the scale. And he says to the first slave, look, here is my money, most likely silver coins. I'm giving you 5 talents of my silver money, my silver coins for you to take. That's the amount of resources I'm giving you. Maybe in a bag even. The slave doesn't know. So it's almost like the slave is invited to grab, to take hold of these resources and to actually discover what is in the bag that the master is giving him. The master is not telling him, I'm giving you 5 talents for music or for singing. He just says, you have a share of my resources. What exactly is there is for a slave to discover. And it's interesting that then the master does not give to each slave the amount in an arbitrary fashion. The text says that each slave is given according to his ability. In other words, it's a very careful, a very calibrated distribution. The master knows each slave individually. The master does what we would call today efficient allocation of resources. Neither too much, nor too little. The master is not wasting his resources. He knows the slave very well, and he gives each slave according to his or her capacity to handle that resource, because the master doesn't want his resources to go to waste. So what do we learn about spiritual things so far? We learn that each of us has received something, that no one has been left without anything. Each slave got the exact amount that the slave can handle. And why is this important? Because people come often to the church with the idea, oh, I need to get something from the church. I need to get something from this community. I need to get something from that preacher or from the Sabbath school leader. But the parable is actually saying, no, hang on, you have received something. The main emphasis is not on you receiving, it's the emphasis is on you discovering what is in that bag that the master has put on the scale, and then you giving something, bringing something with you. Each of you is bringing something to this community. And very often people wander from one community to another complaining how bad it is. I haven't received anything, I have not been fed properly. But the parable is saying, no way. That's not how you should live as a disciple between the first and the second coming. You have actually received something. Discover it and bring it to the community and multiply it. Because no one here is without, no one is left impoverished. Everybody has received something. And then, when this distribution is finished, the text says the master goes away. And that's quite interesting because there is something called, in a contemporary business, if you like, I'm sure you have heard this word, micromanagement. I don't know, have you heard? It has usually a very negative connotation. It means if you are micromanaging something, or somebody rather, you are constantly behind somebody's back, watching every move and, criticizing. So this person really doesn't have any freedom to operate. I don't know, have you had a boss who is a micromanager in your life? Or have you perhaps been yourself a micromanager? But that's a different story. I don't want to be, But what we find in this parable, that God, the master, Jesus, is not a micromanager. He gave his slaves a share of his estate. And then he goes away. He has invited his slaves into freedom. He's not going to be constantly watching them and reprimanding them if things go wrong. They are given responsibility and freedom to do what the master expects them to do. And part of Christian journey sometimes is to feel that somehow God is not present in your life. that somehow God is away. And people often perceive this as a point of crisis. But actually, if you read the parable would say, no, this is an opportunity. Because only when God is not present, only if you feel that God is not watching every move, you can be tested how trustworthy and faithful you have been with those resources and what you're going to do with them. So it doesn't mean that God has to be present in a way that you feel his presence in an immediate sense, that you are aware of every single move he does in your life. That feeling of absence is an opportunity, according to this parable. And the parable is saying, grab it, embrace it, capture it, and show that you are going to live to the master's expectations in terms of resources he's given you. So what happens to the slaves? We read that the first two slaves very enthusiastically take advantage of the opportunity. They grab with a level of assertiveness the resources they received, with interest, with keen interest, and they go off to trade. The language again is of trade and commerce and profit. And somehow they are successful. From the parable, we don't understand why they are successful, but they are definitely successful. And of course we know that these two slaves represent the kind of mindset of people between the first and the second coming, who will recognize that they have been given resources, they have a responsibility, and they need to do something with these resources for the kingdom of God. But then we come to the third slave. And that one is quite interesting. Again, knowing that this third slave represents a mindset, how people will react to this offer. And the parable says, now, before even I say that, I think we need to recognize that this third slave essentially has two options. What to do with the given resources. And he knows both options. He's aware of them because Master himself later on will confirm that. He can either imitate the first two slaves and say, I want to do exactly how they have done, grab resources, go and trade and multiply. Or he can say, well, maybe this is not for me. I am not that kind of person. I really cannot do what they can do. But he has another option. To take this money or resources and put them on a deposit, says the Master. So instead of going and taking the risk with the trade, he can go and say, oh, these Phoenicians there, they are bankers. I will take this money and I will put on a deposit. And of course, you know, today we have rules. If you put your money in the bank, your deposit is protected up to £80,000, I think. So he can take this money safely. And if he does that, he will still generate value for the Master. It's not a big risk, even though they don't have rules on deposits, but it's not a big risk. And in terms of effort, it's almost nothing. But then what this slave does, he does something which is completely irrational. He goes and puts the money into the ground, which means it's far riskier. Somebody can find it there, or may have been seen. It generates no value, absolutely, and it actually requires more effort. You know, so it's a completely irrational choice. And what he does, in effect, he deactivates the resource that God has given him to do. He puts it in the ground where this resource will be inactive. And I think the best example from our lives could be if you, let's say you're a rich donor and you go and you are moved because you found a hospital which, I don't know, somewhere abroad in a third world country is struggling, and you go there and say, okay, I have made a lot of money. I will give you an MRI scan, for example, which costs, I don't know, 2-3 million euros, pounds, whatever. Now use this scanner to treat people. And after 3 years you come. They could have treated people, lives could have been saved, they could have charged for this service. Instead, they put it in a storeroom and kept it there for 3 years. A number of people died, were not diagnosed, because no management has ever attempted to use that gift. What would you say as a donor to the management of this institution? Would you be happy with their response? So I think we see in the parable that God has efficiently allocated the resources according to each slave's ability. But then God has an expectation that these resources should be used productively. And this third slave, for whichever reason, decides, no, I'm going to deactivate that resource. I'm not going to use it productively. And from our own lives, we know if an economy is not based on the idea of efficient allocation of resources and productive use, this economy will go into recession. It will not expand. So this slave, instead of contributing to the kingdom's expansion, he's actually a contributor to the kingdom's contraction and recession. And God doesn't like the slaves who are causing recessions. Do you love politicians who cause recession of an economy? Nobody likes that. It's the same analogy. So it's a very skillful and very clever use of business language. And the life goes on. Now the slaves have to live with the idea that the master is actually not here. This is a new reality when the slaves are running the estate but the master is not here. And maybe some of them think that the master will actually never come back. Such is the norm. But then after a long time, says verse 19, the master breaks into the present reality. It comes back. And that forces slaves to abandon what they're doing. I think that powerful breaking in completely disrupts the routine, forces everybody to suspend all the activities, including the third slave who deactivated the resources and put them in the ground. And they're all called to give account to the master. And when we read how this conversation is going between the master and the slaves, it's a very telling story. In verse 20, we find that the first slave comes forward bringing 5 more talents. And the slave calls the master, master, which I think makes sense. You handed over to me 5 talents. See, says the slaves, I have made 5 more talents. See. So, picture the kind of old style scene, and I think that there is an element of maybe bringing sacrifice, because the word master, the slave is essentially bringing some gifts to the master. It's the same word that is used when you had the Magi bringing gifts to Jesus. Or it's the same word that Jesus uses when he says, if you have an issue with your brother, don't take the gift to the altar, go and sort out things, and then bring the gift. And when Jesus advised the leper who was healed, Jesus says, go and take the gift, bring the gift to as Moses commanded. So that bringing of the talents has, I think that's element almost, because the slave is bringing the gifts to the master. He's bringing the evidence that his faith has been actually a real active faith. It wasn't just an abstract doctrine, but it was something real. He's bringing the evidence. And he's saying to the master, see. He's trying to attract his master's attention to his work. This atmosphere is the atmosphere of confidence, joy. The slave is actually delighted so that he can present to the master the evidence of his faith. There is no sense of fear or mistrust. He's eager to present. It's like a good employee who has worked very hard, is facing his boss, and is willing to show to his boss what he has produced, because he knows that his boss is not some kind of nasty, capricious man, but the good person who will recognize good, honest work. Or like a student who has been working on a draft of an essay and is facing his tutor, and he knows that the tutor is a good person and wants to show how the draft looks beautiful. That is the sense that we get when we read the parable. So there is no fear from the master. Quite the opposite. The slave is very, very happy. He's delighted to see the master. It's the atmosphere of joy. And the master says, in response, well done. And that is, I think, with the greatest respect, a British understatement, because that well done, I think, carries a special power, force, that we don't necessarily capture when we read the text. I think the best way to express in English would be perhaps to say, what a brilliant job, wonderful, excellent job. I've come across some comments which actually claim that this expression was used in the ancient Greek world when there was a public performance and the spectators or the auditors were so delighted with the quality of the performance that they exclaimed, they shouted. And when I was trying to think, how can I convey this idea, for those of you who know the world of the opera, you know at the end sometimes the audience stand up and they clap, bravo, bravissimo. They are so delighted with the performance. So the master in the parable is so excited about the wonderful performance of the slave that he can't really control his excitement. Such is a good job that the slave has done, exactly how the master has accepted. And I think the master is not just delighted because he is excited about the quality of the work. He's more delighted because the slave reflected the image of the master. He reflected his character. He reflected his nature, because the master says, you have been faithful. He's looking at this entire period from the allocation of these resources until the end, and he sees one long, prolonged period of extreme faithfulness and persistence. And this is, I think, what really delights the master. The slave has not been wavering. He has been consistently committed and faithful, knowing this is exactly the actual verb is in imperfect, which emphasizes the duration of that period. So the slave has been showing incredible quality, like a persistent runner who has made it to the end. And the master is fantastic. He's delighted. And then we find the same paradigm with the second slave. The fact that the second slave has only 2 talents doesn't change anything. 5 or 2, it doesn't matter. It's exactly the same sentiment. You know, very enthusiastic embracement of resources, and then hard work, and then presentation, and then the same attempt to attract attention, the same delight from the master. But then we come to the third slave. And this is where the story takes a completely different turn. Completely different turn. When you read from verse 24, what the third slave is doing, it's quite disappointing. And again, we have already established how the third slave, for some reasons, has made this completely irrational choice. You know, he decided to park the resource and pursue something else in his life or her life, which requires more effort, it's far riskier, and generates no value, according to the parable. So the slave comes, and you think at that point, maybe it is still possible to save the situation, perhaps somehow. And the slave calls the master, master. At that point, you're thinking, okay, is he calling him the master because he really believes that he is master, or because he has no choice? You may or may like the queen, but you still call her the queen, you know. But then he says something quite telling. He says, I knew. And this I knew, you know, you can acquire knowledge about somebody from a number of sources. I can read a book about Sister Michelle, or a report, and this report may be absolutely awful, you know, disparaging, and I can create the impression about Sister Michelle based on this report. Now, this report can be completely inaccurate. So we can get the idea about people and events from secondary sources, if you like, reading about stuff. But we can also form our knowledge based on our personal experience with the person. If I know Sister Michelle, and if I read that report, and if I compare these two things, I will most likely, I think almost certainly, inevitably say this report is a piece of rubbish, because my experience is completely different. And this I know in the parable means I read about you, Master. I know you personally from my own dealings This is my experiential knowledge. This is my experience with you. This is how I know you. So he is describing Jesus in a way, I know you, Jesus, who you really are. And then he expands his definition and says, I know, you know what? That you're a harsh man. You know, rigid, uncompromising, insensitive, like this big boss, like this X-type manager who couldn't care less about people. You know, the picture that we have is when somebody has sclerosis. So instead of having blood vessels which are beautifully flexible, they're rigid, hard, difficult to change, you know, completely unreasonable, insensitive. This is how he describes his master. And you think at this point, where on earth did you get this impression from? Because everything that we know about the master up to that point talks about his generosity, his knowledge, his wisdom, how he gives resources, how he distributes resources according to each ability, how he knows the aged slave deeply, intimately. And now we find this completely opposite assessment. And you begin to think, hang on, is this just a pathetic excuse, an attempt to rationalize your own misjudged behavior? So what he's saying, he says, I know you're a hard man. And then he says, you reap, or you're reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter. In other words, you're the kind of person who puts people in an impossible position, gives them no support whatsoever, and demands extreme performance from them. Like this bad boss who wants you to fail. So he gives you lots of tasks, no support, blames you for everything because he wants you to fail, and expects huge results from you. This is the kind of person you are. And you read and think, is this really a realistic, honest assessment of the master? And then he continues the narrative and says, because of your character, the only response I could generate is fear. The only thing you can have as your emotional response in relation to such people is fear. So the fear took over me, the fear paralyzed me, I could not think clearly, and the best I could do is to hide. That's my best effort. It's a plain lie. It represents a response of people who, for whichever reason, said, Kingdom of God, thank you very much, nice illusion, not for me, I know a better way how to live my lives. But when the master comes back, they have to give this full, complete, accurate, transparent, audited account, like the management has to give to the shareholders. You know, they can't lie in the accounts at the annual general meeting. And now they're trying to somehow fabricate the whole story. And pretend they're still morally virtuous. Here is your resource. I don't want anything that belongs to you. To you. Have it back. Have it back. And of course, the master is not impressed. I think it's very hard to impress God with that sort of argument. He called the slave wicked and lazy. And he is a bit ironic in verse 26. But then he says, even if we assume for a second that this was the truth, that I am indeed evil and hard and unreasonable, even if this is the case, even with such a master, you still had an option. You still had an option. The minimum option. I'm a minimalist. You could have taken this to deposit and I would have been happy. How can a wicked and hard master be happy with a minimum effort, minimum return? That itself proves that I'm not wicked. And I think that's the powerful message, because some people may say, oh Lord, you know, I'm not really into preaching, I'm not really into Bible studying, I'm not really into, and I get nervous when I talk to people, and you know, if I try to help other people, they irritate me, I'm short fuse, I'm not really into going African, you know, jungle or whatever, and preaching to indigenous people. This is all too much for me. This whole business of kingdom is just too much effort. And God says, okay, can you come every morning to Sabbath to Aylesbury Church, and just smile to people for 5 minutes? And just write 10 polite sentences and tell them to church, to the congregation every Sabbath. Can you do that? Yes. Well, I'm happy with that as well. As long as you do it honestly. And this is the God that I think we serve. That's the God we serve. Not an unreasonable judge, like a bad boss who is watching every move and punishing you. God who gives, goes away, expects you to grasp responsibility, but gives you huge freedom to judge for yourself. What is the best that you can do for the kingdom? And then accept him even the minimum, as long as it's honestly furnished and offered. So I think the parable is telling us, look, there are so many ways how you can live a life as a disciple until the second coming. There are so many ways. Just read it, pick up your way, find it, discover the truth about yourself, and then stick to it and practice it. And your talent, even one can grow. Even one. You don't have to end up the race with 10 talents altogether. Ending with 2 is fine. You still win the World Cup. You'll get exactly the same trophy. You know, it's not France versus Croatia, where Croatia loses and France wins, unfortunately. I'm Croatian, so I can say that. Everybody gets a trophy in the end. So I pray that as you study this parable, you discover this truth, that life of discipleship is not just about watching, but it's actually doing. It's keeping these 2 things in tension, but in balance. It's having a grip over the 2 pillars that define you, who you are. Who is a good Adventist, if you like? Practicing them both. And recognizing what is that God has given you that balances the scale. So that in the end, when you face God, you say to God, Lord, okay, you had to put 5 of these weights on the scale. I'm sorry, Lord, but now you have to put 10 or 4, because I'm bringing so much on your scale that if you just keep your 5 original weights, the scale will not be in balance. You need to put some extra to balance it. And God will say, well done, your servant. That's exactly what I was hoping to. That's why I ordered some extra weights to balance the scale. You know. Yeah. That is, I think, the meaning of the Christian journey. And this is, I think, what Paul was referring when in Galatians he said that neither circumcision nor uncircumcision mattered, but actually the faith acting as an energy, as power, through the acts of self-sacrificial love. Because I think what the slave does, he brings to the master the evidence that he understood the character of the master and is bringing the fruits which represents the acts of selfless, self-sacrificial love, that he was able to bless other people with the gifts, with the resources that God has given to him. And then God says, enter into the joy. Enter into the joy. I will put you in charge over many things. So what God has given us is just little comparing to what God expects from us to do in his new creation. In his new creation. People in this life work for all kinds of benefits. They work for share options, for salaries, for bonuses, for perks. In the kingdom, you work for more responsibility. Now that may be strange, but I think with this new responsibility comes even closer relationship with the master. It's the privilege of knowing the master better, being closer to him and working with him in his new earth. So I pray that this church and individuals read the parable and apply it in their lives. Amen.